Welcome, everyone. Pleased to present this special presentation on redevelopment on or near oil and gas well sites. I will be your host here for the next 20 minutes. My name is Michael Lupart. I'm with Trace Associates. And before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you to BILD Alberta for facilitating this presentation. As we get started here, I just wanted to provide a brief overview of the presentation and the topics that we'll be covering today. In general, I wanted to provide a high-level overview of the risks associated with well sites. Generally, when well sites are present, they can pose some significant challenges to development or redevelopment, and it's important to have someone that understands these unique development considerations with respect to the environmental cleanups or who's responsible or even what regulatory agency to address with and when. For those of you that haven't met me, I am the gentleman in the front row. This is our 10-year anniversary picture. I'm the gentleman in the front row on the right. And for those of you who may know Christine Johnson or have not met her as of yet, she is the lady on the left. Also important to note here that unless otherwise referenced, these photographs are actually taken from our own staff here. So aside from being an environmental consultant, I like to moonlight a little bit by doing some hand modeling on the side. For those of you who haven't met us, I wanted to introduce you to Trace Associates. We are a specialized environmental consulting firm working on contaminated sites, assessment, remediation, reclamation. We've got offices across Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan, across multiple market sectors as well. The real estate and development sector is one that I lead as the principal in charge. This slide presents a brief introduction into the oil and gas infrastructure and the type of oil and gas well sites that you may find across Alberta. The picture on the right is of a gas well site. You can see that there's a lot less infrastructure than would be associated with an oil well site. In general, and you'll hear me speak about generalities throughout this presentation, in general, an oil well site could be considered to have a higher environmental risk in terms of soil and groundwater quality impacts than a gas well site, with some important caveats that there's a lot of associated infrastructure that could be buried underground in terms of old flare pits, old underground storage tanks, or old drilling waste disposal areas, which I'll speak about shortly. So as we move up the chain here in the oil and gas world, we start to get to these bigger and larger facilities and sites. And I've provided a couple examples here. You've got a compressor or a battery station on the left and a refinery on the right. The refinery on the right, they do refining of crude oil and sometimes natural gas at these locations. And a compressor station, that's something where it's a collection facility for multiple gas well sites. Sometimes they do a little bit of treatment, removing some of the water, some of the other produced fluids. A battery is really a collection system for oil well sites where they collect heavy crude oil and do maybe a little bit of treatment on the site itself. The reason why I wanted to bring up these facilities, and speaking in generalities again, the bigger the facilities, the bigger the tanks, potentially the bigger the environmental concerns or problems. So let's dive right into the big ticket items, I call them. The next few slides, I'd like to lovingly refer to them as lions and tigers and bears, oh my, because these are the things that you want to keep an eye out for if you're working on or around a particular well site. And I've presented some examples here, and these examples, albeit they could be quite extreme, I wanted to talk about them because they have some unique stories behind them. The photo on the left is from a famous flare. It's called Hell's Half Acre. And this is a site in Turner Valley when the oil boom originated there in 1918, I believe. This flare helped off-gas some of the natural gas product, which was actually considered a waste product at the time. As you can see, this flare is not standing up. It's a flare pit. And flare pits were quite common until around the 1990s. The interesting thing about a flare is think of it as the holy heck button on a drill rig. So if there's a problem, or if you're producing something and there's a problem, you send it to the flare. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's all gas. It could be anything that is produced within there. And don't assume that everything that is lit on fire goes up into the atmosphere. You can see from this flare here that there's a trail of what I can only assume to be crude oil or some other kind of produced liquid that is traveling down the slope, and I think eventually towards some kind of river. But the interesting thing about Hell's Half Acre, through a period of time, I believe in the 1930s, it actually was so bright and so significant that you could actually see it from Lethbridge. There was about a 25-year period where you could actually see it on the horizon of Calgary. It looked like there was a second sun setting. Regardless, this is something you want to keep an eye out for. Big or small, flare pits do pose a pretty significant risk on sites, and they're hard to identify and track. On the right, you'll see what we call a drilling waste disposal area. And for those of you that aren't familiar with oil and gas infrastructure, this is another significant concern. Typically, when people go and drill wells, and particularly after around the 1920s or the 1930s, people started to include drilling waste disposal, or sorry, drilling waste to help lubricate the drilling bit or provide some safety in terms of pressure variations. The challenge with drilling waste disposal areas and drilling waste was that primarily the concentrations were made up of bentonite and water, but people added some pretty interesting and unique things to the drilling waste. This drilling waste was then pumped down the hole, but then it was collected and amalgamated on site in a pit. And why that pit is important is up until around 1990, there wasn't really a requirement to do anything with this pit on site. And this isn't a lined pit. This material was really just backfilled over and left on site, and the well site operations continued. The problem being is these additives to the drilling waste, sometimes they contain some heavy metals like chromium, who knows what else. A lot of different significant things were added to these. But then also diesel as well was added to these pits quite regularly, or these drilling waste areas quite regularly, as well as caustic soda. If you ever watch Breaking Bad, you know what that stuff is. But definitely poses an environmental risk in terms of the soil and groundwater contamination from a property. The next two big ticket items I wanted to discuss are tanks and spills. The photo on the left is from an underground storage tank, and this is from a natural gas well site. And why that's important is produced fluids associated with natural gas production. Typically, they're amalgamated in these tanks. They're seen as a waste product. Waste products such as produced water, condensate, any other kind of crude material, crude oil that's pumped out of the well as a byproduct of the natural gas production. And the reason why that's important is because it's seen as a waste product, and therefore there's a payment involved in order to come and evaluate and pump out and transport and appropriately dispose of that material. And what I've seen and what I would probably argue is that the maintenance and the inspection and the installation requirements associated with these tanks is not even in the same order of magnitude as what you could consider reasonable for a gas station or a service station. I've pulled several of these tanks out personally, and I've seen holes the size of a car in the side of the tanks. I've seen tanks duct taped together, literally. In this particular instance here, this is a great example. This is a dipstick here next to the underground storage tank, and that was used just to evaluate the fluid levels in the tank so they could tell when it was full and pump it out. And in this particular instance, when we pulled the tank out of the ground, it looked like Swiss cheese at the bottom of it, and that was because as the operators were testing the fluid levels, they were piercing the base of the tank, and therefore any kind of product or anything else was going into the associated soil and groundwater. So much so, in fact, we actually found impacts in the soil and groundwater 150 meters away from this well site. But hey, they never had to empty it, so there's that positive. The photo on the right, and this is an extreme example, quite a famous photo actually, is from the largest oil spill in Alberta's history. And this originated from Leduc in the 1950s, with a big oil discovery out in that area. And this resulted from, as they were drilling, they pierced the producing formation. The drilling waste that they were using, or the drilling fluids they were using, didn't have the right pressure coefficient, and everything blew up. And at first, everything blew up and nothing was on fire. Well, that continued for several months, and the well site continued to effectively blow out, produce over 1 million barrels of crude oil is what they estimate. But eventually it lit on fire, and that's where we get this photograph here. And really, this is an extreme example. It is the most extreme example in Alberta. But the reason why I bring that up is every day in Alberta, there are 3 reportable oil spills that we know of. I would like to argue that prior to that reporting mechanism in the 1990s, that there was a lot of other spills that went unreported. So definitely a risk that you want to keep an eye out for on a well site. I wanted to provide a visual representation of the oil and gas facilities that can be encountered in our largest urban centers here. You've got Edmonton and Calgary. You'll notice Edmonton has a lot of infrastructure out to the west. This is actually called the Atchison Field. The city of Edmonton truly is the city of champions in this respect, in terms of being surrounded or having well sites and other oil and gas infrastructure nearby. It's quite a famous field in Atchison, and there's a a nice saying internally in the oil field world that there's a lot of skeletons in Atchison. For better or worse, what they're referring to is there's a lot of old facilities and infrastructure and a lot of things that maybe happened that weren't necessarily reported or discussed back in the day. But Calgary's no slouch as well. We have a significant amount of oil and gas infrastructure, primarily to the northeast and the east of town. A lot of this is natural gas production, where you could interpret that maybe the environmental risk is a little bit less than something like the heavy oil production in Atchison, but it does pose some significant health and safety risks for development because of H2S considerations. A lot of these natural gas wells are H2S rich, and that can be quite dangerous. I wanted to spend a little bit of time just discussing the status of a well site because it becomes quite important in terms of any kind of future development planning or reclamation or remediation. The reason why that's important is there's many different statuses of a well site. And the words in particular in this slide, they have significance. You've got your flowing, your pumping well, and that makes sense. It's producing fluids. You've got your suspended well. It's important to note that sometimes the suspended well can almost look like an abandoned well. But the important thing to note is that when it's suspended, the well site owner actually has the ability to come back in and produce that well again and turn it back into an active so-called well site. Once the well site's truly abandoned, the wellhead's cut and capped below ground surface, generally no infrastructure remains at the site. And then it starts the reclamation process. Now, important to note that this program was introduced in 1963, and I'll discuss more on that in a minute, but the reclamation process, currently in Alberta, there's no guidelines or guidance or regulatory requirement in terms of how quickly that reclamation process should proceed. I'll speak from experience that there's some well sites that I started on working early on in my career that are still being reclaimed to this very day. There's an important distinction between reclamation, though, and then this thing called reclamation exempt. And in particular, in terms of who's responsible, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. But prior to 1963, there was no formal reclamation process. So formally, you could argue that there was no requirement to do any kind of environmental cleanup or potentially even abandon facilities in an appropriate manner. So let's get right to the heart of this whole issue, why we're here, who's liable, who's responsible, who's going to pay. And that's very important to understand because it changes depending on the well site. You've got your active well site, and that makes sense. If your licensee is actively there, you've got a big oil and gas company, well, they're going to be on the hook for anything that goes wrong, any kind of soil or groundwater contamination, anything that's found in the future, they're going to be on the hook. If they go defunct, we've got this industry-funded organization called the Orphan Well Association, and the intent with this organization, this association, was to prevent any well sites that fall through the cracks. If a licensee goes bankrupt or they become a defunct company, the Orphan Well Association, in theory, is going to pick up that tab and help pay for any reclamation, remediation, or assessment of any kind of soil and groundwater impacts. When the well site is an inactive well site, the Alberta Energy Regulator is responsible for enforcement, and the licensee is obligated to go and fix any of those problems. Surface reclamation, 25 years, we're not really worried about that, but contamination, particularly soil and groundwater contamination, that licensee has a lifetime liability, which sounds great unless the company doesn't exist anymore. Well, now, okay, we've got the Orphan Well Association. That sounds great too. But what if that well site was drilled prior to 1963? Because then the Orphan Well Association or even the AER could argue that, well, really the responsibility now squarely falls back on the landowner. So potentially the landowner could be liable and responsible for cleanup costs. So what if you find a problem? What are you going to do about it? You have to quantify your risk. And this process, albeit is quite similar to how you would do it on a typical urban site. But in this instance, it's not potato. There's, albeit in general, the same procedures that would be followed for a well site, for that of a contaminated site in an urban setting, but the processes themselves are quite different. And I'll use a phase one as an example. A phase one in an urban setting, we've seen those, we probably understand what it entails, is very different than a phase one for an oil and gas well site. If you remember things the drilling waste disposal area is a great example. There's a whole compliance section that says in an oil and gas phase one, okay, if you drilled to this depth and they did this kind of drill stem testing and they added these kind of amendments from the drilling waste, then you have an obligation to drill a phase two. Then when you go to a phase two, there's a different protocol than an urban setting. It's not just confirm or deny contamination. You have to go and assess an example of a drilling waste disposal area. There's a requirement. You have to drill X many holes, you have to collect X many samples. And the reason why that's important is because Alberta Environment and Parks and the AER want different things. The municipality wants different things. And I'll discuss that a little bit in a minute here. But you have to understand who you're trying to, whose requirements you're trying to adhere to. Or another example is if you're doing this work in conjunction with an oil and gas company, they're going to want to see other things on their site, not just a standard urban phase two. The great thing about this process, though, is we still have all these other tools and tips and tricks that we can help assessing understanding contamination. You've got site-specific guideline development. We don't always have to do a dig and dump. We can do the subsoil salinity tool. We can do a human health risk assessment. So those tools, albeit a little bit different, still can apply to these contaminated sites on well sites. This topic ties in nicely with the one on the previous slide here. This is the perfect example of requirements, what the AER requires versus what Alberta Environment and Parks requires versus what a municipality may require. I've had a lot of discussion about this pipelines. To be clear, the AER does not require removal of all the pipelines on a site. Some pipelines they do, and there's some specific instances. What the AER currently requires is that those lines are purged and capped and cleaned and left at the ground. Well, that might not work for an urban development or a municipality where their requirements is that you actually have to remove these pipelines out of the ground. The risk from that comes on this historical infrastructure, where one might argue that maybe the decommissioning procedures weren't as stringent as they are today, where there wasn't that purging line requirement or cutting or capping or any of that stuff. That didn't exist. So when you pull these lines out, there's the potential to dig up some other stuff as well. And I've seen that. I mean, this is an example on a typical well site where I pulled out a line, and at first we had to purge it, we had to clean it, but that line had been abandoned for 35 years, and we were able to pull a significant amount of product out of there that required some special disposal considerations. So something to keep in mind for development. This is a good example of another additional development consideration, buried wellheads. So there's about 500,000 wellheads in the province, and eventually they're all going to get abandoned, and eventually they're all going to get buried below the ground. The AER has some really good guidance on what kind of setbacks must be kept. Now, important to note that those setbacks are probably different than what a municipality has in terms of how close you can get to that former infrastructure. There's also some really good guidance on how to decommission or cut and cap these wells currently. And I could argue that historically, particularly any time between before 1960 or 1970, that maybe those decommissioning protocols weren't as stringent. I guess what I'm getting at is when you run into a wellhead on a site, and hopefully you don't physically actually ever run into a wellhead, but if you ever have a wellhead on your site, strongly consider staying away from it at all costs. What I mean by that is that these wellheads, they might have been cut and capped 50, 60, 70 years ago. If you go and hit this wellhead, I could use the analogy of if you break it, you buy it, or if you touch it last, it's your problem. If this wellhead starts to have a mini Leduc oil spill again, and that's a very significant over exaggeration probably, but if a problem starts to occur, it might take a long period of time to figure out who's responsible and who's going to pick up the tab for any associated remedial work. The other thing I wanted to bring up with this slide here is typically we cut and cap wellheads at least a meter below the ground surface. And typically that sounds like it's good enough in terms of depth, unless you've got some deep utility installations or some other kind of underground utility in the area. Why that's important, though, is a lot of these historical well sites were cut and capped below ground, or below a meter below ground surface. Well, that area was continually farmed for the next 50, 60, 70 years. That surface is slowly eroded, and therefore the wellhead might not be a meter below the ground surface anymore. Or if you're changing the grade of your site, you have to have those considerations in the back of your mind during development, because then who picks up the tab for this next round of cut and caps. Who's going to pay to re-enter this or to come back into this well and cut and cap it again? And that's something that is definitely a significant consideration. Well, folks, looks like that's a wrap. I really appreciate you sticking with me throughout this presentation and wanted to thank BILD Alberta again for facilitating this presentation. As always, happy to help. Should you ever have any questions or comments or concerns, feel free to give me a call. Thank you.